Hi everyone, it's Susie here, Crypto Granny. Now, there's been a lot of articles out there, and certainly on X, Twitter, whether Ripple XRP Ledger will be used by Swift. And I thought I'd do a video on Swift and what it is exactly, and what rules are behind Swift, and whether they can actually use XRP Ledger. Now, to my knowledge, Swift is only using XRP's drivers, but they're certainly not using their ledger. They are looking at other blockchains. They use Chainlink, which is something we're invested in. They use Chainlink for their pricing oracles and for their security, but they're not actually using XRP Ledger at this stage. Also, as I said, they are looking at other blockchains at the moment. They haven't sort of said yes or no. Well, clearly they haven't said yes to using XRP Ledger, notwithstanding that Ripple is trying to get them to use XRP Ledger. But again, there's a number of reasons why they can't at this stage. They'd have to get approval from, the Federal Reserve Board. They'd have to get approval from other regulatory authorities in the US to use Swift, and also they're members of Swift, which basically the members of Swift, there's 11,500 banks in the world, the biggest banks in the world, would have to agree to it, okay? So Swift in itself stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication System. It is an old messaging system from 1973, and it basically uses COBOL, which is an old coding language for coding messages, where I've used Swift. It's very old, it's very clanky. You have to be, at a terminal. You need a terminal in the bank that you're sitting in, and another terminal in another bank over the other side of the world. And you have to be there at the terminal to actually accept Swift messages. So say if I send a message from Australia to the US, obviously different time zones, then someone in the US needs to be sitting at that terminal to accept my messages. That's how old and clunky it is, okay? The banks make the payments with Swift codes, and they make the payments with big codes, but Swift itself is actually a messaging system itself, and the banks have the platforms to make payments, okay? So that's really important to distinguish between clearly XRP Ledger, which makes the payments. The banks themselves actually make the payments. So, as I said, it is represented by 11,500 banks. It's responsible for operating the global network that enables secure financial messaging and transact communications between thousands of banks and financial institutions around the world. Some of the largest fund managers also use Swift. Some of the largest investment banks also use Swift. So what does Swift do in the scheme of things? It is a member-owned financial cooperative headquartered in Belgium. And again, as I said, it's 11,500 institutions, banks, financial funds, investment funds in over 200 countries. And it does include payments, but it's the bank's infrastructure that does that: securities trading, debt trading, equity trading. But you can use Swift for crypto, but it's a bit complicated. So Swift does not move money itself; rather, it transmits payments using Swift codes, as I said, known as bit codes, and these are the references. Swift is important because it is regulated. It's a crucial facility for interbank transfers between global commerce, and it's reasonably secure. Mind you, there was a bank, the Central Bank of Bangladesh, used Swift, got hacked $600 million back a couple of years ago, because Swift is a centralized system, okay? And it was hacked because someone got into the terminal of Swift and sent a message to another bank. And essentially the money was, sent out of the Bank of Bangladesh to another account, Swift account, and the money then went into orbit. It is a standardized transacting messaging system format across its own platform, and it is old and it is very clunky, but it has adopted the international standard of transactions of 20022. Swift, as is supposed to be politically neutral, But we know when there's problems with governments overseas, say in terms of America, SWIFT basically has most of its membership, some of the largest banks are US based, but there can be sanctions on SWIFT accounts, particularly say with, politically at risk people or terrorist organizations, or when there's political problems, say with Russia as an adversary or China. The banks have been disconnected from the SWIFT system or blacklisted, so they can't actually get access to actually transmitting or doing anything on SWIFT, okay? So this will actually impact on their ability to, exchange funds on their own terminals, which is really important, okay? So, and this is very different to XRP Ledger, where you can see all the trades publicly. With SWIFT, it is private. Member banks pay an annual fee, and they pay fees per message, okay? And those fees can be quite expensive. And also they do international wire transfers, but these costs can be extremely expensive as well, okay? And this is why when you do anything with the SWIFT code, from one terminal to another, the client often often has to pay the fees, but also often, if you do a SWIFT messaging system code, you may not get your money for a couple of days. And that's why something like XRP Ledger would be ideal, because it can transmit money within, 3 seconds, right? But it would mean that all the 11,500 banks would have to agree to it, and they would all have to use XRP Ledger. Now, it's highly unlikely they would do that at this time, because, Ripple basically needs a credit rating for counterparty risk as well as for settlement risk, okay? And also it has to show privacy. Now, we know XRP Ledger is operating on privacy databases, okay, or private ledgers rather than the open public ledger that everyone can view, right? So consumers, as I said, often encounter high fees when sending or receiving international wire transfers, and these costs obviously get added onto the consumer, and especially from when there are intermediary banks involved, because SWIFT does require that, you need an intermediary bank to actually convert certain currency. So say, for example, I'm an Australian bank and I want to send Australian dollars to, say, the Middle East. There may not be a Middle East bank that accepts Australian dollars. So I need to use an intermediary, say Hong Kong Bank, that will then convert those Australian dollars to, say, US dollars, and then send them out to the Middle East, where a Middle Eastern bank will actually use the US dollars, okay? Will actually accept US dollars rather than Australian dollars. Now, SWIFT does have governance and oversight, and as I said, the oversight is SWIFT is governed by the world's central banks globally. So Ripple would have to then go to all the central banks globally, right, to get approval for the member 11,500 banks of Swiss to actually operate XRP Ledger. And these banks include the National Bank of Belgium, the US Federal Bank, Federal Reserve, the US central banks, as well as the European Central Bank, as well as the UK Central Bank, and so forth. So that's a big stumbling block for Ripple, particularly with SWIFT using XRP Ledger. They have to then get approval by the central banks globally. And again, with SWIFT, you also need, as I said, a counterparty rating and a settlements rating, because we're dealing with the transfer of money flows. This is traditional finance, right? And this is the traditional role in the global financial markets. Many companies that are small operators don't use SWIFT. If you're a small export and import company, you don't necessarily use SWIFT because it's very, very expensive to use. And only the large investment banks and the large fund managers can afford to use SWIFT, okay? But payments, it uses secure standardized messaging for bank transfers and international banks. But the banks actually have to put up in their SWIFT messaging system payments which are aligned to their own internal infrastructure, which makes payments, right, or receives payments from another bank that's also a member of SWIFT. And I think that's an important distinction, okay? And as I said, the messaging system will include trading securities, equities, and debt. The compliance is fairly important. It has anti-money laundering rules. It has know your client rules. It has rules for sanctioned countries where SWIFT won't deal with countries that are sanctioned, like, for example, Afghanistan or any terrorist type organisations. So, you know, it does have very strong compliance rules. SWIFT's infrastructure and standards are critical to modern banking, enable reliable, secure. I wouldn't say fast. It's definitely not fast. If you miss one side of the world to the other in terms of financial communications, just with a terminal, then, you know, that payment or receipt could be delayed. And that's often a big problem. And that's why banks need to use Nostro and Vostro accounts, which is another subject completely, which means they need to fund their internal accounts because they never know when the money's going to come out or when the money's going to come in. Certainly XRP avoids that, XRP Ledger, with open demand liquidity, because you don't need to fund Nostro accounts or Vostro accounts, a Vostro account being your account with another bank and a Nostro account being your own account, right? So XRP, in terms of open demand liquidity, would avoid all that sort of problem. But clearly, it's going to take a lot more than Ripple just to talk to the central bank about getting the approval of XRP Ledger for SWIFT to use it. But I think in time, you know, SWIFT will have to look at a payment system. And I certainly think in time, XRP Ledger is a very, very good payment system. And certainly what XRP is doing now is they're looking at private ledgers. And that's certainly something the banks are going to want, a private ledgers where they can make payments within 2 to 3 seconds, not having to fill up their Nostro or Vostro accounts and fund those because they don't know when the payment's going to come in with SWIFT or the receipt of SWIFT. And, you know, I think that's, you know, a fairly important thing they need to certainly look at. XRP certainly may be the answer. But again, you know, even though XRP is fast settlement and it is compatible with the standardization of Swiss messaging, it could be a player in the future. But I think at the moment, to be perfectly honest with you, it's probably a little bit early. Certainly they are testing XRP Ledger alongside other technologies, but have not, you know, they've not confined it to XRP. SWIFT is looking at the most realistic scenario and they're seeing what's going to suit them. Now, we do know that Chainlink is there. We're invested in Chainlink. That's why I love Chainlink, right? XRP could serve as one of the several options in Swift's interoperability framework. That's why Chainlink's there, because Chainlink has interoperability between traditional finance platforms and cryptocurrency networks, okay? Recent discussions explored whether SWIFT could integrate XRP Ledger formats for messaging transaction volumes. It certainly could, but again, it needs to be approved by the central banks, okay? And that's a big one. It's a big sticking point for Ripple. In September 2025, SWIFT began running trials on several blockchain systems, including XRP Ledger, to explore how these are going to interact and interoperable with Swift's technology, enhanced cross-border payment system. And certainly that's something that Swift need to do, actually, because as I said before at the start of this video, it's a very old, clunky system from 1973, and it was built on COBOL, which is an old coding language, okay? People don't even use COBOL anymore, right? Whilst Ripple is enjoying growing institutional adoption, including projects like RLUSD stablecoin, which is being used by BlackRock, one of the biggest fund managers in the world, Swift has yet to say that they're going to formalize this partnership. And, you know, I think, you know, if XRP gets listed on the stock exchange, Ripple, and if they get a credit rating and they get approved by the central banks, then, you know, they could, you know, potentially, and also approval by the largest investment banks in the world, 11,500 banks, then, you know, it's a long stretch, but it's not unrealistic. Then yes, they would use XRP Ledger for that. You know, and I think that would be very interesting in itself. You know, because Ripple is an amazing system. XRP Ledger is amazing. And, you know, again, Swift need to come into the real world of what's happening with cryptocurrency technology, okay? It's made it clear at the moment it's neutral, but it is looking at other networks for cryptocurrency payments and interoperability and payment systems like XRP Ledger. So, yeah, very interesting times ahead, people, very interesting times ahead. I mean, as I've mentioned before, XRP Ledger provides impressive speed. It's settlement finality, settling transactions in 3 to 5 seconds. Plus, it has on-demand liquidity, and it has cross-border liquidity, filling the gaps that Swift currently has. And, you know, from a regulatory point of view, it needs to get those hurdles in place where it can actually get approval by the central banks, as well as the largest investment banks and big banks that use Swift, okay? Many people are saying that one of XRP Ledger's competitors is central bank digital currency, possibly, but, you know, again, with central bank digital currency, you know, stable coins, you've got to also have integration into the SWIFT system from the central bank digital currency. And if we talk about US Tether, for example, it's on the stock exchange, but not listed. It doesn't have a credit rating. And that's something the banks will look for as well. And I think with Ripple going to an IPO, maybe in the near future, you know, the next year or so, it could also become a bank. That's going to put it in a better position, but also with a credit rating. But it's questionable whether 11,500 banks want to use Ripple, a bank, if it becomes a bank, if they just want to use their technology or not. We do know that some of the largest banks are still using Swift, but they're working on their own blockchain. So albeit Ripple is making headways, it has a long way to go to get Swift to actually use it. But notwithstanding that, there have been some great partnerships out there. Ripple have just announced a partnership with Deutsche Bank Securities and Franklin Templeton, and this boosts certainly institutional credibility. Okay, and Swift continues to attract capital. Swift may view it as a stronger contender in the future, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that goes. I mean, it's unlikely, I agree with this, that Swift will use them as just a single counterparty. They may use XRP Ledger with Chainlink, which is already a client. Swift uses client already, Chainlink already, I should say. And, you know, they may use other mainnets as well, because they certainly need to upgrade their technology, which is a very, very old technology indeed, from 1973. I mean, it's akin to XRP Ledger, you know, being the Ferrari, and I said this years ago, and Swift being the old horse and cart. So pretty much that they need to look at a solution, and certainly XRP Ledger has paused become one of the solutions in Swift's toolbox, providing fast liquid settlements with on-demand liquidity. Anyway, guys and girls, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you.